And in today's Voice and Action panel, we have Tavale Ilalio and Santilla Chingaipe. Tavale is the founder and creative director of Mahana Culture. Born in Samoa and raised in New Zealand, culturally awakened in the USA, and now settled in Melbourne, he brings a unique perspective on culture and its strengths if respected and risks if not dignified and acknowledged. With over 20 years management experience in the public sector spanning across 4 countries, Tavale's passion to create safe and culturally responsive individuals, teams, and organizations and communities drove him to bring to life the vehicle for this work, which is Mahana Culture, a business which delivers on the capacity building required to truly lean into cultural responsiveness in practice. Full of energy and passion, Tavale is super pumped to be joining the YSAS Festival Ideas today, adding some value to the conversation and listening and learning from other leaders and innovators in the space. Santilla Chingaipe is a journalist and filmmaker whose work explores migration, cultural identities, and politics. Chingaipe is a regular contributor to the Saturday paper and serves as a member of the federal government's advisory group on Africa-Australia relations. The recipient of a number of awards, she was recognized at the United Nations as one of the most influential people of African descent in the world in 2019. Her first book of non-fiction, detailing untold stories of convicts of African descent transported to the Australian penal colonies, is forthcoming in 2021. They'll be joined in conversation today by YSAS's own Shannon Bell. He's an Australian-born man of Maori, Scottish, English and Irish heritage who works as a CALD Youth AOD outreach worker at YSAS. The journey of cultural intelligence has played a significant role in his life, learning to become comfortable in his own skin and with his own story. He hopes to now encourage others to take up that journey also. His passion is to serve others to become proud of who they are and to help others restore their sense of cultural dignity and self-worth. Shannon strongly believes that diversity is a strength. So today, in the panel, they'll be discussing voice and action, exploring the meaning of voice, ways to take action, and methods of making meaningful change. So please welcome Tavale Ilalio, Santilla Chingaipe, and Shannon Bell for Voice and Action.
Welcome to the session of Voice in Action. I'd firstly like to just do a formal greeting, followed by an acknowledgement of country in my own native tongue of Te Reo Māori. E hara taki tō e te tō takitahi, engari he tō e takitini ti hei mauriora. Me mihi ki a i o matua, nana te kore, nana te pō, nana hoki te au I whakatinana, e mihi ana, e mihi ana. Ko ranganui e tū iho nei, ko papatū anuku e takoto ake nei, tēnā koe o tērā tēnā kōrua. I nā tini mata e nā atua, haere, haere, haere atu rā. Nō reira, rātou ki a rātou, tātou ki a tātou. Nau mai, hara mai, whakatau mai rā. Tēnā tātou e te hongo ora, nau mai hara mai. He mihi tēnei nāku ki te tangata moi moi nā kaitiaki o te whenua nei, ko te pāpaka nui a Māui, ata āhua, e mihi ana, e mihi ana. Ko toku pepeha, te taha toku pāpa, ko te kapatātu maunga, ko wakari te awa, ko nā pui te iwi, ko nā toki maruwharo atu waka. Ko nuku tāwhiri te ariki, ko wakari te marae, ko Jane toku mātua, ko Mindy Ashley toku whaia, ko Danielle Joy toku tau, ko Maya Joy toku pepe. Ko Shannon Bell toku ingoa. My name is Shannon Bell, and I just wanted to pay my respects to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and their connection to country and place here today. So today I'm thrilled to be joined by Tavale and Santilla. Welcome to both, and thanks for being here as a part of the discussion. I'm going to say it right off the bat. I'm a little bit nervous. There's a little, yeah, totally. So, I guess firstly, from a Māori perspective, in order to know where we're going, I guess we need to know where we've come from. And so I thought I'd start maybe with you, Santilla. Do you want to share a little bit about who you are, where you're from?
Yeah. That's a really great question. I don't get asked it enough, and I think it's such an important question. I am from what's now present-day Zambia, and I say present-day Zambia because my family, or the people that I descend from, come from different parts of Eastern and Southern Africa.
Okay.
And so I come from two ethnic groups. So I come from the Lamba people on my paternal side, and I come from the Namwanga people on my maternal side. They're both very, very small ethnic groups, but I'm very proud to be a descendant from those groups. But yeah, that's my cultural heritage.
Yeah, cool. What about yourself?
Yeah, I think it's always such a beautiful way to start off. And, even since I've been here in Australia, the acknowledgement of country has become mainstream. Like, I've only been here 12 years, and that's become embedded into how we, a ceremonial component of how we kick things off. And I think that one of the most important things I love about it is right off the bat, you're acknowledging the other. You're acknowledging the presence of other ways of being and seeing. So, it's just a real tautoko to you, my friend, and so happy to be here. My cultural tale, which I'll talk a little bit more about, the kind of importance of that from a work perspective, spans from being born into a individualistic collective continuum. My dad's from Bango Tutuila, American Samoa. My mum's Irish, Scottish, New Zealander, Kiwi, and my dad somehow convinced my mum to go back to Samoa and have kids, little half white, half brown kids. And so straight off the bat, I was born into that difference. So born in American Samoa, mum and dad separated, moved to New Zealand, raised up in New Zealand, and was blessed enough to be able to attend bilingual high school. So I learned everything in Māori and English, which has been such a gift. My family's from American Samoa, so most of them have moved to the States. So after high school, went for a 3-week trip to Southern California, and I had this massive Samoan family that was mine. I'd only seen them, other people had them. My dad's one of 17, and I was in, and it was, as Candace had alerted when she introduced me, it was such an awakening for me to really ground myself and start reflecting on who I was, how that impacted on what I do. So 3 weeks turned into 10 years, stayed here for 10 years. So Southern California, I recommend it. Anyone's in their early 20s, give Southern California a go, it's the bomb. And came back through New Zealand, did my study, etc., and regrounded myself in Aotearoa, and decided to give Australia a go 12 years ago. And I've married Melbourne, so I'm stuck. I'm stuck here in Melbourne, and I have little Australians that call me dad, so I'm super stuck. But I love it. I love the difference. I love the sport, the food, the people. It's been such an amazing next season of my cultural tale, and it's ongoing, and I think cultures, it stems from the ethnicity, but there's so many other parts that have woven to make me up. So that's where I am so far today.
Yeah, awesome. I think one of the really cool things about that is it gives context. It gives context to people, and often we only we just engage with what we see, not necessarily with what we don't. So I kind of I agree with you, Brian. I agree with some of your sentiments as well. I guess this year's been challenging for a range of reasons, but firstly I think I just wanted to ask, how have you been going through the COVID-19 pandemic? I was in the Uber this morning and talking to a taxi driver, and an Uber driver, and he was just telling me that he had 3 jobs and he'd lost 2 of them. And now Uber was his only thing. So it's been different for different people. How's it been for you?
Like with everyone, it's been very challenging. But I have to say, I think the pandemic that hit me the hardest was probably the Black Lives Matter movement. I think that one really shook me in a way that I think I hadn't expected. I think you spend so many years of your life sort of doing anti-racism work and hoping that you get to a point where you begin to have dialogue, because for the longest time, particularly in a country like Australia, there's been so much denial around racism, despite the fact that so many people have been saying that this exists, and we can show you that we're having these experiences. And then to see that happen in the way that it happened, in the context of the pandemic, where it's literally impacting your respiratory system, and you've got George Floyd saying, "I can't breathe," with the backdrop of our summer bushfires, where the air was also impacted. It was quite it was a lot. It made me really think that we can't allow this moment to sort of move on by. Like, it can't just be a thing where we're like, okay, we experienced that in 2020 and, you know, it's done. It's like we have a real opportunity to sort of fix a lot of things that we've gotten wrong for so long. And for me, that was something that really, I would say, changed the course of my life, because I think the thing with racism is that it makes you feel like you are paranoid, or you're crazy, or, you know, your experiences
abnormal.
That's right, because, you know, the systems in place, because that's just the design of racism, sort of try and trivialize your experience, or sort of say to you, if you don't have evidence to back it up, it can't be real, right? And then to have that moment sort of, I guess, validate and affirm so many of the emotions that a lot of us have carried and experienced, and to sort of go, wow, like, all those things I've experienced weren't crazy, like, they did happen, and I matter, like, my life is actually significant, was a big thing, because I sort of thought, wow, I wish this happened when I was a teenager.
Sure.
Because it would have liberated me in a way that I wouldn't even know how to articulate.
Yeah, of course.
You know, like, it's just so interesting what a movement can do in terms of not just on an intellectual level and with the work and all of that, and it's absolutely important, but just as a human being, like, what it gave me, I was like, wow, I did not expect to feel this way in my lifetime, for sure, because you're always just working and hoping that you get to a point where you have dialogue. And then you do, and then you go, wow, I didn't think we'd get to this point. So
totally. A lot of the work that I do with a lot of young Māori, Pacifica and African young people, when they ask me about my job and stuff, they end up going, oh, you get to do that just from being Māori, like, you get to work with us just from being who you are. And I'm like, oh, I didn't realise, I didn't know that, you know. What about you, bro? Like, in terms of the COVID pandemic and the change and the systems, have you faced it through this period of time?
Yeah, and, you know, just really resonating with what Santilla's talking about. You know, it's we can talk about the pandemic, and personally, I've had some family that have been affected in overseas, but it hasn't, like, personally come into my realm and circle, which has been a really interesting balance to navigate. But I think, you know, really resonating with Santilla's conversation, it's just provided this opportunity to reset. And I think it's pulled back the veil on stuff that's been broken for a long, long time, systematically, culturally, personally. And, you know, that's been such an important and grateful opportunity to really reflect, you know, and start imagining, start dreaming, you know, from an Indigenous perspective about what can be from here. Because if we don't take this opportunity to innovate and celebrate, but also look to create new ways of being, resetting where we sit, you know, so that rankism is starting to be called out, you know, like, we sit here, no, we can bring all this amazing difference together, and, you know, some powerful statements through the Black Lives Matter movement that called that out, you know, and so personally, from my work perspective, and also my wider circle, I've really leaned into it and been really appreciative of, you know, hard times, you know, trying to be a maths teacher to my 6-year-old and getting called out on my shortcomings in that area, but, you know, my family, we still like each other, you know, me and my wife still love each other, and we're still going. So I've actually been really appreciative of it, but it's going to be for nothing if we don't collectively come out of this shifted, I guess.
Yeah, it's very true. Santilla, you're no stranger to the idea of cultural diversity or intersectionality. What does cultural diversity kind of mean to you, and how does it impact you on a both personal and professional level?
That's a hard question. I think cultural diversity is such an interesting one, because I think that everyone has a culture, even people that think they don't have a culture have a culture.
Yeah.
The reason why I say that is that, for people that are fortunate to come from cultures where their histories are written down, they have the stories that tell them in some way, shape or form who they are. But for me, I think cultural diversity is, and I think this is something we touched on earlier, when you asked that really beautiful question about, our backgrounds in many ways. It's about a sense of who you are and your sense of identity. And it's a bit more complicated if you come from a marginalised community that, because of colonialism, because of racism or slavery, whatever those systems of power and control are, that either dispossess communities, either redefine borders, either displaced bodies. A lot of those communities have their stories erased from them because the very act of colonialism, the very act of slavery, the very act of displacing bodies is getting people to forget who they were, right? So that they become something that you can control, because that's what these systems do. And so it becomes a lot more complicated when you come from these groups, because you're constantly working to remember who you are, right? Totally. Like who are you before colonialism? Who are you before all? And so it's a very difficult thing because, a lot of my work is, and I only realised this recently, but is actively trying to archive the memories as I understand them now, because I've got a big awareness that it's not always the case that these stories will be remembered, and that those of us that don't come from the privilege of coming from groups that have the power get a say in how we're remembered in the future. And so for me, cultural diversity really is about ensuring that when we are talking about different groups of people, it's about always trying to also centre the groups that have traditionally been marginalised because of that power dynamic.
Wow. I'm just going to say I'm loving this. This is awesome. This is like, if there was ever a time that I just want to have these discussions, I'm like lapping it up. Awesome. I normally do all this stuff in my own personal time, and now I get to do it sitting here with you two. Tavale, I've known you for some years, and you've done a lot of work within the Māori and Pacific Island communities here in Australia. And obviously you're the founder of now what is Mahana Culture. Would you mind sharing your thoughts on what, I guess, cultural intelligence and cultural diversity means to you, and how's it been working towards that?
Yeah. Well, I shared some of my cultural tale, just a snippet of it. And there was difference and diversity all through that, from gender, sexuality, being from a single parent home, ethnicity, I'm eating jam and scones with my white grandparents and corned beef and taro with my Samoan grandparents, it's this really interesting concept of diversity is this new thing, but difference has always been, and it's been vital. Life doesn't recreate and regenerate without difference. And there's some beautiful piece of work coming out. Actually, David Attenborough, there's a Netflix special. Watch David Attenborough's latest Netflix special, because he says that at some point we stepped out of the relationship with nature and into our own kind of sphere and saw ourselves as greater than. Than all those other relationships that we'd been nurturing in indigenous ways around the world have been nurturing and looking after for thousands and thousands of years. But if you think about from a nature perspective, an environmental perspective, diversity is the only way that life keeps recreating and innovating and coming up with newness, and we are part of that. Let's not kid ourselves. We are nature. And there's this really exciting conversation starting to have about how can we look to, the diversity that we are in always, and bring it into our people systems, and how we see each other. So, from my perspective, it's always been here. It's complex, but it's vital, and its diversity isn't some bubbling brook and unicorn that we get to. It's hard work. It's hard stepping into the other space and having a different opinion, respecting it, giving it dignity, both stepping away dignified. You know, that's not something we just can do straight off the bat. So yeah, that's been vital to recognise, you know, in my work. And I remember hearing a Aboriginal elder before a welcome to country ceremony saying, we live on the world's oldest multicultural country. Like before any boats arrived, which apparently the boats had like 75 different cultures themselves. This was a country of different languages and ceremonies and land and nations, etc. So we stand on the shoulders of that difference, you know, and it feels like there's been this glitch in the last 300-400 years. We've kind of forgot that, but it's just a glitch, you know, and how exciting to be part of a generation that's starting to speak to that again and you know, level it out so there isn't, you know, that power dynamic, but how can we bring all of our difference together to create newness, I guess. So super important.
How do you manage some of those more complexities and stuff that you're talking about, the harder times around difference? Yeah,
and I think that's it's a really important question because, you know, I know, you know, diversity and inclusion is a real catchphrase around, and we talk about it. But I think one of the most important parts, especially for professionals working in a super important organisation like YSS, is like, how do we take that and embed it into practice, you know, practice amongst our colleagues, and practice into the young people that we're working with. And there's tools and frameworks and postures, you know, that we can support each other to learn and share, so they're ready for that space. I think what's really important, you know, from a Mahana perspective, is that we were never set up to do the work for a YSS. You know, but it's important to be able to build our capacity to be ready to do the work. You know, have the lens to do the work. You know, because you've got this amazingly skilled and talented workforce. That's often in our professional studies leading up to this work, we've only been given one component of that difference. In the practice frameworks we work in, you know, the mental health and psychology frameworks, and then, you know, that's no one's fault. That is what it is, you know. But that's the institutions we go into to work into these institutions, and, you know, if we can plant the seed of the importance of difference, then, you know, imagine the kind of conversations that can happen in boardrooms or amongst frontline teams, you know, or what can we do? How can we do things differently here? But that takes time in itself, and that's the space we're in. It's all relational. It's relational, you know, and that's old school. But you know, there's an exciting chance to step back into it. So definitely some tools and frameworks of how you know, we move into that space.
How do you go about managing difference? And because it is complex, right? So often I think when we talk about cultural diversity or diversity, which is difference, often people in some ways kind of refer to the other, but often the person that you stand like sitting next to, you have, regardless of the colour or the background, you have quite a lot of differences, personality, whatever that is. How do you go about managing some of that?
That's a really good question, hey, because one, I hate the word diversity, because what diversity says is that there is a centre and then everyone else works around that, right? And therefore everyone else has to either become like the centre in order to be seen and accepted, or that their ways of seeing, being and doing things is not the norm. And that's very problematic because obviously, you know, the Western gaze is not the only way of looking at things or the only way to solve problems or the only way to be in the world. And I think that, I mean, I work with history and understanding how things, where things are born from is a big part of making a sense of how we are where we are now. And racism as a system was created, right? It was created out of slavery because it was how this economic system was able to operate. So you subjugate these people, you strip them of their identities, you strip them of anything that they can relate to where they're from. And in order for you to keep exploiting them for their labour to build the new world, so the Americas, you have to tell them that they're less than. You have to tell them that this is not who they are. And you begin to create a system of classification, right? And that system of classification is what you then start to create narratives to keep these people subjugated. So you tell them that you are inferior, you are lazy, you are not like us, right? And while you can outlaw those sorts of systems eventually, you can't outlaw cultural attitudes, right? It's kind of like in Australia as well. Like we had a racist white Australia policy ended in the 70s, right? So it's illegal now to be racist. But it doesn't mean that you can outlaw the cultural attitudes. It doesn't mean that just because you sign something out of law, the belief system that you put into people, the stories that you fed people about others and why these people are different automatically go away. And I think that when we're talking about diversity, inclusion, or whatever other language is being used to sort of dance around the power structures at play, we'll never really start to get to the heart of what the problem is. There's a power imbalance, and the power imbalance is whiteness is at the top, everyone else is sort of here, right? And the question is, why is it that way? Especially in this modern age, particularly in multicultural Australia, right? Tavale, you talked about the origins of Australia being multicultural even before colonisation, the fact that we had so many Indigenous First Nations communities that made up so much diversity, right? But we don't talk enough about that. We don't talk enough about what we can learn from those communities in terms of not just the wisdom but the knowledge as well, but also how we can solve some of the problems that we're being confronted with now. Like why do we disregard that knowledge and that wisdom? Why must it always be through a Western gaze? And these are the questions that we have to be asking ourselves, because that is what racism has done. It has created that power imbalance. And until we start to actually frankly talk about that, we'll just be dancing around these issues. We'll sort of be going, you know, let's do this, let's do that. And it's a symptomatic thing. It's not going to fix the problem, you know, because I don't know, like as humans, we I could go on. I know I get into a very nerdy history sort of thing, and I was just about to like go 400 years back, and I just had to stop myself and go, you know what? There's only so many hours in the day. But I guess, you know, I think in order to sort of start really addressing some of the issues that we have to acknowledge that they're born out of the system of racism. And I think what's useful about understanding in terms of racism is that it was created, you know, like there's nothing inherent about any human being that their skin color says or does, right? Any assumption to that regard is essentially racist. And so if we created the system, we can dismantle it. But we have to have a willingness to want to dismantle it. So it's always, what are you protecting? What are you afraid of letting go? Because everyone else that's on the margins has learned to sort of live in harmony. Because when you talk to people that come from culturally diverse backgrounds, because this is why I have an issue with it, because everyone is culturally diverse, but if you talk to people that are classified in that sense, you'll find that a lot of them generally tend to have friends, family that come from different parts of the world, different communities. And there is harmony there, right? And so it's sort of like, these communities get it, so what's happening, you know? And until we start being frank about that, it makes it very difficult to sort of really address some of the problems that have arisen as a result of this inequity.
I love that. I love it. And we've adopted a lens to start unpacking that very dynamic that Santilla's talking about. And it actually came from a big piece of legislation from New Zealand in the late 80s called Puao Te Atatu, which translates into daybreak. And they started doing a deep dive. They got this amazing think tank to do this deep dive into the inequity of Indigenous Māori outcomes from the kind of DSS, DHS equivalent in New Zealand. But actually what it turned into was a real unpacking of the structural racism at play within that government department. So they developed this really unique lens to look through the different tiers, and it was personal, cultural, institutional, and it was around racism. It was institutional racism. But what that allowed them to do was understand how those three tiers were working at play, you know. So personally is often the, you know, Black Lives Matter stuff, you know, that stuff cuts deep, you know, like that gets into us. And institutionally, what they found was, as Santilla was saying, or talking to, was a lot of the institutional policies, ways of being, actually manifested from culturally, how we were culturally, how we were as a society of people. And you can imagine that I'm sure that's how laws often happen here, like the same-sex marriage law that came out a few years ago. That lever got pulled when culturally it was widely enough accepted and fought for that was something that needed to happen, and so institutionally the lever pulled. But again, if you bring it down to an organism like YSAS, unless that kind of cultural shift is supported to happen, that's relational based, that takes time and pain and shadow and light and hardness, then a lot of those important institutional goals, which can take generationally. I was laughing at this because I'll deep dive into doctrine of discovery from 1495. As colonisation happened, like we are greater than, and the ripple effect of that through the last 10 or so generations still stands. White Australia policy isn't that old. Institutionally, it's not around anymore. Culturally, it's still rippling. Still rippling, and so I think it's beautiful. It's bringing light to that, and how do we create the space to have those conversations and have them safely and with dignity, and look at other ways of being and how we can fuse and innovate, and but we don't do it at a greater than, less than perspective. It's poison.
I think I don't know, now, don't hold me on this quote, but I think it was someone like Adolf Hitler who says, you tell someone a lie long enough and they'll believe it. Or like, sorry, if you, for him, he was speaking to the Jews about how, and just completely making them less than for such a long period of time. And then I was reading something on the history of it, and they were like, this kind of stuff you can't just get rid of it overnight. Like, you tell someone, if you behave towards someone for a long period of time, that doesn't go away just just because we've changed the policy, or that doesn't go away just because something structurally might have shifted a little bit. But I guess, Santilla, you do a lot of work in terms of the education or conscious raising awareness space, in terms of the anti-racism activist space. Do you want to talk a little bit about the emotional impact that's kind of had in terms of some of your experiences?
And it's funny, you use a historical example of Hitler, and I was like, we've actually got a modern day example of Trump that lied, and people bought his lies as the truth.
Now that he's out of office, I just didn't want to really use his name.
but I think the point about education, I guess for me, when I think about stories, and Tavale touched on this, which is a very interesting thing, because I don't normally talk about the strategy of how my work works, but in many ways it does two things. So on the one hand, I think about the systemic challenges that we have, right? And in order to dismantle racism, what's required? And unfortunately, in many cases, you need policy changes, because you need to force people into action. Because human beings sometimes don't necessarily act in their best interest or in the interests of the community, right? So you need people that are in positions of power to have the foresight to sort of go, you know what, this is who we want to be going forward. And
change is uncomfortable, right?
That's right. But in order to do that, you need to put pressure on them, right?
Sure.
And you need to sort of hold them accountable, and you need to ensure that they are operating within the law. And when you're dealing with these sorts of issues, one of the things that we really lack in this country is, apart from a framework, I mean, you give a perfect example of New Zealand, but here we really lack a framework, or even just, this week I was reading about how the UK had an inquiry recently looking into racial inequality in the UK, and this was commissioned by the Conservative government, which in itself is tells you a lot. This is 2020, and we don't have anything similar. We don't have a sense of what racial inequality looks like in Australia in 2020. There's a lot of hearsay, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, but in terms of organisations that are trying to implement policy, how do you go forward by doing anything, right? Because you don't quite know the makeup, you don't quite know how it's impacting communities in many ways, because there's just not a lot of evidence that you can use. And so that makes it very difficult. And so there's one part of my work that seeks to really push for that kind of change. But then there's the other part of my work which seeks to sort of change cultural attitudes. And part of the problem with racism is that it, apart from doing a really damaging thing in terms of how we look at each other and how we look at other communities, it also impacts the self-esteem of young people, you know, their sense of not just who they can be in the world, but what they're supposed to be. And that's where the conversations around representation become very important, right? Because if you cannot see what you can't be what you can't see, basically. And for me, there's one part of my storytelling is vital in not just getting people to see themselves, but also people that haven't been exposed to people outside of their own communities, or people that speak a different language to them, or people that come from a different religious background. Yeah. You might have ideas about people, because that's where unconscious bias comes from, right? It's these ideas that are formed by narratives. But so if you can have sort of diverse views about these communities and these people, you start to build empathy. So then the next time you come across someone who doesn't speak the same language as you, doesn't look like you, you know, you're more likely to sort of see them as an individual, not as all of these things that you've, you know, been conditioned to think about based on what you have been exposed to in the media, which might potentially have a negative impact on your encounter with that person. So I think both are useful, because when they do collide beautifully, you do have moments like you were pointing out with the marriage equality vote, where the cultural attitudes and the law are marrying at the same time, right, to bring about change, because people are ready for it. And it's kind of doing that and hoping that at some point they'll both marry, and we can see some long-lasting changes that future generations can reap the benefits of.
So how have you managed in terms of, obviously you do a lot of work in that space, how do you manage the literally, like, the emotional labour that it is? Because I think sometimes, you know, I talk to some of my colleagues and who have previously been African, and they talk about that because constantly they're referred to. You know, whenever there's a diversity issue, or there's a young person of African background, they're the ones that, you know, it's kind of like, oh, what's your opinion specifically? What does that play out for you? Is that not?
It used to. But now, because I've got a body of work, I just refer people to my work. I'm just like, I don't, because I can't keep repeating myself. You know, I've only got so many hours in a day. But also, what I generally tend to find is that those conversations are still quite infantile in their stage. Like, I'm not interested in talking about why is something racist. Why is this I'm not interested in talking about the trauma of racism. Sure. You know, I think we should be beyond that point. I think we know that racism exists. It is real. We cannot, you know, I'm not interested in sort of trying to figure out what is and what isn't racist. And generally those conversations tend to be in that kind of, or packed in that way. What I am interested in, and these are conversations that I rarely have, how do we begin to dismantle racism? Sure. You know, and the ways in which it manifests, whether structurally, whether through unconscious bias, like how do practical ways. That's right. How do you institute? Yeah. How is it that in this country, if you are an Aboriginal woman or you are a woman of colour, you are likely to, you know, have a higher mortality rate, right? Like infant mortality rate than another group. Yeah. If you present at a hospital, you know, you're less likely to receive the same kind of care as someone that's, you know, non-Indigenous. The rates of incarceration are much higher for people from Indigenous and, you know, other groups. So it's these sorts of things. I'm like, let's start addressing this, because this is what's happening. We're seeing this disparity, and it's unfair that children that are being born in this country are having very different outcomes purely because of the colour of their skin. So until we start having those conversations, I'm happy to sit and talk about those all day. What I'm not happy to talk about isn't this racist? Is blackface wrong? Can I use the N-word? Like, you know, like...
If you don't know those things, go and educate
But also
yourself.
there's so much on the internet. Google is free. Like, it's... you know, so... But yeah, it's kind of... It depends on how people want to engage in those conversations. And if there's a willingness as well, because at the moment there's this language of like, you know, I just want to listen, you know, I want to listen to, like, you know, ensure that, you know, I'm hearing what people are saying. And we were hearing this a lot, particularly once the global Black Lives Matter movement kicked up. And my question is, like, are you listening intently though? You know, you can listen, but what are you doing once you listen, right? Because everyone can, like, you know, sometimes I have the radio in the background and I'm listening to it, but do you know what I mean? Like, it's like, are you listening intently? And what are you doing with that information? And that's what I'm really interested in. And unfortunately, we don't spend enough time having those conversations.
Yeah. Thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's that kind of shift from my perspective. It's that shift that we talked about. We've got this kind of triangle of cultural ways and that we use in Mahana. So cultural intelligence, I know that's a big part of your journey, is that real self-awareness. It's like seeing the water that you swim in. Understanding, as Santilla was saying, a lot of people don't feel like they have a culture, but like there's coffee places in Brunswick here that have become ceremonial, like there's faith, there's sexuality, there's gender, there's, if you're from the country or the city, like all those tales make us up, and we all have them. We all have a culture, and we all have a rich, deep cultural tale to explore and bring to the table, so we can start to work on the empathy of others. So cultural intelligence is seeing the water you swim in. It's a super important place to start. Cultural awareness is being able to see other currents. And I think often in this country, and I'm sure a lot of your YSAS workers have started there, we go straight to cultural awareness, and then usually we go straight to Aboriginal cultural awareness. And it's kind of like going to the museum. If you haven't done the back work, you go to the museum and see these beautiful paintings and pictures and hear these stories and watch these movies, but you have no idea why you're at the museum, and then you don't even know what to do with that information when you leave. So if you have a real solid understanding, I know why I'm going to the museum. I know what I'm going to do with that knowledge. I'm excited to have the conversations about how I embed that into practice. I'm going to listen with purpose to some of the stories that are told, because I'm wanting to do something more with that, and then manifesting that into cultural responsive practice. There's lots of different tags. These are just the ones we use, cultural competence, etc. But for us, really like cultural responsiveness, because I think a lot of the time, especially in the diversity space, racism, minority space, it's quite reactive. In terms of how we develop policies or projects or programs, YSAS might come up with, etc. And we react to those things. But if we've done the back work, had the hard conversations, started building that listening with purpose and that empathy within us, then we can respond. And we can respond before things may even happen, because we're ready. We expected that to happen. We're ready. We've done some work. And, that nice little triangle, I think, is a really santillic starting point, I guess, for us to anchor ourselves and get to, that important space that Santilla's talking about us being.
Yeah, wow. Bro, so you've got a background in social work. I tend to know you a little bit. I know you personally as well, and you've worked obviously in the sector for many years. How would you like to see, I guess, the idea of cultural diversity, practice in an everyday space? What does that look like to you if you had your...
Yeah, and I shared again my cultural talent. It's really nice to start off with that space, because we don't often start off with bring ourselves fully to the space. But I've been lucky enough to work in that sector across the States, New Zealand and Australia. So that gave me a really unique perspective that I'm sure isn't, I'm not the only one, but that's part of my tale. And when I got here, especially working in courtrooms and case meetings and schools and health, etc., just seeing, especially from a mainstream perspective, a lot of these practitioners, youth workers, managers, teachers, etc., who wanted to get to that space. They wanted to get there, like their heart was there. I'm here to help and serve and look after people, but they hadn't been given the opportunity to stop, pause, reflect, build that capacity to listen, to act, to respond, etc. So they were, and they went through this training that was in quite a singular cultural context, through universities or whatever that is, and then sent out into this difference without the tools and the but without the toolkit necessary to be able to work into that space. And from me, bro, I feel like I just want to do my part to create a space for the sector, especially the sector that works with people. It's the human services sector, and it's big and it's wide. To build that capacity to be able to work into that difference, that they are part of, and it's not centralised. It's centred, and it's not rankist. But the hard conversations can happen, and they have the capacity to work into that space, because like difference is just going to keep on coming. And there's this beautiful Native American saying that we drag a cultural tale 1,000 years long. Martin Broken Leg from the Lakota country speaks to that. And it's this lovely idea that we sit on this continuum of 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. So it's this tale that we're on, and it's our time now. And decisions that we make, and spaces that we enter into, relationships that we nurture and look after, are informed by 7 generations back, but they will impact 7 generations forward. And there's a responsibility in that. And I think for this sector especially, they're working with some of the most marginalised, vulnerable, were 50 metres behind everyone else at the starting line when they were born, kind of stuff. Like there's that responsibility needs to be nurtured and looked after, so you have this workforce that is ready to lean into that, to listen, to be different. To innovate with fusion, give up some of themselves, which is hard, things that they've learnt, but a whole lot of the rest of us have had to do it. We do it every day. We give up some of ourselves so we can lean into the mainstream way of being. But that's changing, and so how do we equip each other to work into that? So that's what I hope. I know it's big thinking, rainbows and stuff, but we're all doing our part. So I'm just really privileged to be in the space that to add some value to that.
Did you have any thoughts on that, or should we move on? I think we might move on.
Yeah, didn't have any thoughts.
Yeah, cool. So we might move on to some live questions now. So I guess Santilla, can you tell us maybe a little bit about your filmmaking and how that kind of allows you your voice, I guess, and the voices of others to be heard?
So for me, I was explaining earlier, one of the things that I've realised because of these histories that have impacted how we now live our lives, whether it's colonialism, slavery, and the legacies of that. The legacies of that have meant that, again, that power imbalance exists, and it means that certain communities are either overlooked or underrepresented in our storytelling. And obviously stories are very important, because stories are how we get a sense of self, a sense of our identity. And so for me, when I first started making films, it really was not, I knew that I wanted to tell the stories that I was curious about making and telling, and it just so happened that it was reflective of my world, as in, the people that I call friends and family, and they cover every corner of the world, every kind of community. So it wasn't a conscious thing to sort of go, I want to be representing these communities. It was just the world that was being reflected back to me.
Sure.
As I kept making the work, that was when I realised that a lot of these communities tend to be overlooked in the mainstream, and if they are reflected, they're usually reflected in a way that is in the negative, or is in a way that is not perhaps the full picture of these communities. And that tends to be damaging, because when you have a single story about one community or one person, that becomes the only story that you focus on and that you think that that community is. And we know the long-term consequences of things like that. So for me, it was just really about trying to not remedy that, but just counter some of those narratives in some way.
The art, I guess, of being able to tell someone's story is quite powerful. How do you, like, is there any sort of kind of complexities that you faced in being in kind of doing that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, not to say the obvious, I'm a black woman making films.
Sure.
So it's not, it's not as easy as other people would have it, because, I mean, one of the challenges that I face is that I sit at an intersection of gender and race.
Sure.
So I experience both racism and sexism, which is very fun. I'm joking, it's not fun. But because of that, it has meant that not only impacts how you work and some of the barriers that you have to sort of jump over, but it also just means that your work, there's a burden that comes with representation that we don't talk enough about, and this is part of the problem of, keeping people out of some of these spaces for so long, that when you do have someone that does enter that space, there is an expectation, unspoken or spoken, that you will then be the person that goes on to tell the stories of all the people that have been forgotten for so long because they haven't had the opportunity to tell their stories, right? And as much as I love that, that cannot be a responsibility that's taken on by one individual, nor should it be. I think we have to be thinking about ways in which, again, we live in multicultural Australia 2020. It is absolutely unacceptable that sectors are not reflective of the cultural makeup of this country. I think that there was a time that maybe that could have been acceptable, but it's no longer acceptable. I think we have to be very conscious about the spaces that we are creating, the workplaces and the environments we're bringing people in, and ensuring that we are truly reflective of our community, because once we start doing that, that then starts to trickle into the stories as well. Because when you have more people at the table that get to tell different versions of stories, we start to see, different versions of being, different versions of who we are. And so because of that, it makes it very challenging, because, there's not a lot of you. And again, I'm but one person, cannot tell a million stories. Like I said, I come from 2 ethnic groups in Zambia, and it has 74 ethnic groups, right? And even in that context, I can't tell all of those stories. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it becomes a very complicated thing. And I just hope that when we start thinking about how we start dismantling some of these things, we really start being conscious of having multiple perspectives, because for the longest time we've had a partial perspective, but we haven't been given the full picture of who we are, and we have to start really acknowledging that. And it's not just, stories are powerful in that way, and I think they can play a powerful role, but I think workplaces, community groups, churches, all of these spaces have to really be aware of, what stories have they been telling themselves about who they are, who are they letting in, who are they keeping out, and why? And is it acceptable in 2020 to exclude anyone from anything? The answer is no. And if you are not bringing certain people in, then what is it about how you are structured that's limiting that, and start to work to bring about change, because it's just not acceptable to have a partial perspective on anything. In a multicultural country like this.
Yeah, not in this space. No way.
No.
I completely agree. Tavale, we'll go to our first live question. Tavale, you provide a cultural responsiveness training, a range of professionals with an emphasis on relationship and inclusion, in co-creation and framework called VAR. Do you want to speak to that framework a little bit? And how you put this into action in the community?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as I alluded to, a part of my cultural tale, and of those of some others in the Mahana family, is from Polynesia, but across the world, again, as I alluded to before, there's these amazing indigenous systems that have been built over thousands and thousands of years. Ironically, the Aboriginal way of being was built to eliminate rankism. Like, that was not okay any shape or form in terms of how people interacted with each other, communities engaged in knowledge sharing, etc. So VAR is a Polynesian framework which talks to that space, and VAR is the space in between. That's, I guess, the most simplistic description of it, and we've adapted it into some of our own language. But what we've found important for people to start having these important conversations of difference and sharing stories is if we can create a shared language around what that is. And from Mahana, that's VAR. We present VAR, but we encourage if you've got your own that you think might work, and it's a wayfinder. Albert Wendt, who's a Samoan academic, writes that our VAR with others defines us. So VAR is about the sacredness of the space, and when you step into it, when you acknowledge the other through acknowledgement of country, etc., that you're aware of it. So in Mahana we talk about recognising it. So we see the space, there's a sacred space that we're in this morning, but VAR's always, it's not just micro, it's macro as well. We awaken ourselves to it, we tell our stories, we bring ourselves, and it's safe. We explore, we start looking at who else is in that space. What are their stories? What are their perspectives? How are they different from ours? How could we start doing some stuff together? We nurture it. We look after it. In Samoan, this beautiful saying called te oleva, which is to nurture the space. You look after it. You keep it sacred. Because that's on you. If you haven't taken that responsibility, and in collectivist cultures, that's shame on whole families and communities if you haven't done your parts and te oleva, nurture the space, and then emerge. What can come out of that? What can come out of those important conversations and sharing of stories, new projects, new ways of doing our meetings, how we engage, new HR policies, whatever. Like the possibilities are endless, and so VAR creates a shared language. That's what we present, because I think it's really important. These things aren't mainstream practice yet. Where even though we work in the industry of relationships, often in our day-to-day work, it's very task orientated. And there's a balance around that. It's not sitting and sharing our stories all the time, but when and why and what the purpose of that is. So VAR creates that shared language, and it comes with postures. I am a learner. I give dignity to others. I'm a listener. There's a posture that comes with each of those. Whether that's physical, mindset. I'm going to step into the space as a learner, as a listener, giving dignity to all. And the beautiful thing about VAR, when it works well, everyone leaves dignified. And that's what we're working towards, a dignitarian society, which ironically is what we had. 500, 600, 700 years ago, and in a number of places around the world. There's always been conflict and difference, but we're built here, especially in this country, on a society of dignity. And there's some exciting opportunities to revisit that. VAR is our wayfinder that we bring to the space.
Yeah, cool. Santilla, can you tell us a little bit about your upcoming book, Black Convicts? What highlights about narratives and migration throughout history in Australia?
So very quickly, the book came about because I got frustrated I'm sure you remember the summer when the African gangs crisis and all that sort of stuff was sort of taking over the discourse, and I found that the public debate, to be incredibly frustrating, particularly not just from a political leadership role level, but also from the media perspective. And one of the reasons why I found that debate to be quite problematic was a lot of the narratives were quite racialized, because there was they were implying that the reason why these young people were committing the crime was because of the color of their skin or their cultural background, which is by definition racist, because again, there's nothing inherent about anyone that makes them behave a certain way because of their skin color. All of those assumptions are racist assumptions. And so I found that problematic, and I'd spent about, at that point in my career, 10 years of my journalism work documenting why these narratives were racialized and why we should stick with the facts, because if you stick to the truth, you can't make up things about people because they're just presenting as they are. And I was frustrated with the fact that even that wasn't working. You touched on before, you tell a lie enough times, it starts to become the truth. But one of the lies that was being told at the time was that the reason why young people or people from African backgrounds were failing to integrate, and that they were a recent presence in Australia, and I knew that wasn't factually correct. I knew that people that looked like me hadn't just arrived recently, and so I went back into. I decided to go into the archives and to start tracing back some of these stories. And to be honest, I was going to be happy with like a handful of these people because that was enough evidence, because that was going to be, right, I've got enough evidence to sort of argue that these people have been here since at least a European settlement. And if that's the case, then they have been integrating, and everything you've been saying is essentially racist, you know, because what do you say to that? Yeah. And so the archives took me back to the First Fleet. And so from the First Fleet, and virtually in every single convict ship up until the 1840s, there were people of African descent. And so I'm now sitting at about 400 and something black convicts.
Okay.
And they all have incredible stories, and it's fascinating. But what it tells me is, again, who gets to tell history, who gets to tell our stories. But also, if you tell one version of a story, you start to think that that's who you are. When in actual fact, Australian history is far more interesting than we're made to believe. Can I just say that? Just, you know, even the convict history was multicultural. You know, like my book specifically looks at people of African descent, but I can tell you there were people that came from other parts of the world as well. And the legacies of those stories and those people live on today in their descendants. You know, so I'm making a documentary that's coming out with a book that's going to be on SBS, and the documentary centers the stories of a lot of these descendants, you know. And it's incredible because, you know, again, you know, it's a complete erasure of a lot of these histories. And why do we keep centering certain narratives and just completely erasing others? And also the frustration with doing this work was a lot of academics and historians had picked up on some of these stories along the way, right? Yeah. And I wondered why these stories were never, even just the handful that they'd picked up on, were never disseminated, right? Or why they were never shared widely or brought to wider audiences, you know? And there's a frustration as well for me because I don't come from a history background, right? I'm a journalist by trade, that's what I do, but all of a sudden I'm a historian. But it's a frustrating thing because I had to go and rewrite the stories of people like me into the national narrative, you know, because there was also the fear that my own existence might be erased 100 years from now. And that's a fear that people that don't come from marginalised groups have, you know. And Tavale talked about that wonderful parable about history being linear, you know, that there is a forward and then there's a past. And that what you are doing today shapes what's to come. And unfortunately, what we've been doing for the last couple of centuries is repeating the same thing over and over again. And we're still not learning. We still keep erasing certain stories and certain cultures and communities. And we know what that's going to look like because we've had, or in this country, we've had about 200 years that's shown us what that's looked like. You know, and do we want another 200 years like that? And we kind of have to really be frank about what we're saying. And these are uncomfortable stories, and I absolutely get it. Whichever way you're looking at it, it's an uncomfortable thing to be dealing with. It's not a comfortable place. But we cannot change, and we cannot change our future if we're not being honest about some of the dark parts of our history and our stories.
Yeah. This next question, I guess, goes to either of you. So, do you think we can eliminate racism in a capitalist society?
Well, I'll have a go, and I just want to touch on something that an important point that Santilla put up earlier is around bringing the invisible visible, you know, around the biases that we hold. You know, there's unconscious biases, and I think unconscious bias often comes quite loaded in terms of a negative. But you know, it's a collection of shaping that we've had all through our lives, right from how our parents, you know, gave us messages, etc. But I think the important thing to reflect on about biases is you don't do a position, you hold a position. You know, you don't do a solution, you reach a solution. So if you're holding and if you're reaching, that means there's action in there. And if there's action in there, then it can be unpacked. it can be reflected on, it can be explored as you step into another space. And I think that's an exciting scaffolding part of that question. I'm not going to answer that question in whole, it's big and it's important, it really is. But I think there's lots of different parts at play if we're going to get ourselves into the space to be able to ask that question, ask it safely, like what can I do here? And I think being able to critically reflect on your biases, not all the time, you don't have to keep on saying, well, why do I see this like this and why do they see it like that? But knowing when and where and why to do that is going to be a really important tool in creating empathy. And empathy is acknowledging, honouring, looking after other ways of doing things which don't rely on I am greater than, you are less than. And I think, if we personally start making those steps, it becomes cultural. And if culturally that's happening, some of those institutional, I totally agree, sometimes you just have to say, bam, let's put this policy in and reverse engineer things, like it's super important. But it starts from us, as individuals, who are part of a collective, what are we going to do? So I'd like to throw back that question and take the we out and put you in there. Like, what can we take responsibility and accountability for right here, right now? Your organisation is giving space for these conversations to be happening, and that's an exciting sign, exciting time in the journey. So I guess that would be my take on that important question.
Did you have any thoughts?
Do I think can we eliminate racism in a capitalist society? Short answer is no, long answer, potentially.
Okay.
Reason is that we can't talk about dismantling racism without addressing economic inequality, right? And part of the problem is that the economic system that we live under generally tends to marginalise people that do come from minority backgrounds. And also because of the way the capital system is set up, it rewards individualistic behaviour, right? So it sets up these myths of expectation in terms of people from already marginalised communities, that if you can go off and be exceptional, everyone else can go off and be exceptional. And we know that that's not true because people aren't starting at the same base. Yeah. And I think that when we are talking about racism, we also have to talk about class at the same time. I think that these are very much ideas that cannot be separated in many ways, because we do know that there are people within minority backgrounds that come from middle class backgrounds and are potentially well to do, but are not and are sometimes upholding some of these racist ideals, right? And we don't talk enough about that because that's just how the system is set up. But I think I'm an optimist by virtue of what I do, because I tell stories for a living. So I can envisage a world in which we can work to chip out some of these things. I think it's very difficult with the economic system that we live in to eliminate racism because of the way it rewards individuals.
Yeah.
So yeah, I could get into it, but it's a very complicated question, but it's a very important one, because I think that when we are talking about these things, we really should be thinking about the role in which class plays in all of that, because we do know that generally the communities that tend to be marginalised and are on the fringes generally are the communities that are economically disadvantaged as opposed to others. And it's that intersection that's really worth not just unpacking, but also really challenging as well. Because what racism has done by its design in controlling people is that when opportunities are offered to people in marginalised communities, it's always that case of there can only be one. And that in itself is problematic, because what that then starts to do is it culturally starts to create an environment of lateral violence, right? Where it's why is there only opportunity for one person? How dare that person step out of this space, right? So there's a lot of complexity that the current economic system sort of does to entrench racism. And we really do need to be talking about it. I don't think that you can have a conversation about racism without talking about class. I think that the two are very much linked.
Well, we might go on to our last question. I have noted a bit of a hush approach around discussing issues on racism amongst work colleagues. what/how would you recommend to be the first step in having these discussions safely?
I'll touch quickly on it, and just to leverage off, some of the space that Santilla talked about in terms of creating opportunity to share stories as a way to showcase difference. And in our work, some of the most powerful sessions we do are with teams and supporting them to share their cultural tales. They've done some work, and we give them a framework of blood, birth, and choice to base those off. And it creates this really strong and powerful platform to then leverage and base off to start having those discussions. And you create safety, you facilitate, you bring the VAR into it, and in regards to this is how we're going to do it. So I'd be suggesting that starting off formalising. So it's not just left to the water cooler discussions, the institutionally YSAS, or management team leaders give some space for their teams to start unpacking their own difference. What individual difference do I bring? And, where have I experienced racism, rankism, ageism, sexism, all those things. And, but structure it safely, before you step into that space, because that can be traumatic. Just talking about difference without setting the space up right. So I think that would be a really important place to start, because you have to practice to have those hard conversations.
Yeah,
they don't just happen. They're hard enough to happen at home with your family who you've been together all your life with, let alone people who you only spend 8 hours a day at most with, especially in this time. So I think formalise it, stake in the ground. A good starting point is to have safe conversations around difference.
So the question is, how or what would be your recommendation in terms of the first step in having the discussions safely around issues of racism? What would be your...
That, firstly, one, I empathise with the person asking that question, because it's a very difficult conversation to have, especially in a country that's still not quite reckoning with racism. And so most of the systems and most of the institutions are already operating from a place where whiteness is centred. And until there is a higher up requirement for these conversations to be having, it will always be a difficult thing to have a conversation. I think, and I really do, I greatly empathise with that, because I think the emotional labour will be there. I don't think that we'll ever get... I think once the institutions start doing their job in ensuring that there's systems in place that people can actually have these conversations safely without feeling, that they have to suppress themselves and things like that, because again, that's another byproduct of racism, is that you have to modify your behaviour, modify your language in order for you to just to be seen and heard, and sometimes even that doesn't work. And the burden should not be on that individual. And it's unfortunate that this individual is in this position that they feel that they have to hush their voice in order to say something that is of consequence to everyone. So my only advice would be, when they do feel safe and they think it's appropriate, to do so. But I also know that with speaking up about some of these things, there is a fear of retribution. So there is consequence. And so I try to be very careful with what kind of advice I give in that context, because unless I fully understand the situation that person's in, I can't sort of go and do this, because that could then impact their own career prospects. But what I should emphasise is that the organisations themselves have to be doing the heavy lifting, not the individuals.
I think it is complex because the workplaces themselves have their own cultural narrative. So when you say you can't necessarily give that piece of advice, it's because of you don't necessarily know and feel all those kind of different complexities. I just wanted to thank you both for your time and sharing your knowledge and experiences today. For people watching who might want to get in contact or follow some of the work that you've been doing in the community, where can people go? Either of you?
I have a website. It's my first name, my last name.com.
Super easy.
Yeah, same as us, mahanaculture.com, Facebook and LinkedIn. And I just want to say, from a final thought perspective, my thing would be keep going. Keep going. This is an amazing week that you've given yourselves the gift of, and so many important conversations to come from here, and I'm really excited about where you're going to take these, and just being super honoured to be here. So.
Did you have any final thoughts or reflections?
Yeah, I mean, it's the Martin Luther King quote. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So if you just keep chipping away, eventually the tide does turn. So,
awesome.
Like you said, just keep going.
Keep going.
Awesome.
Just keep swimming.
Just keep swimming. It's like that Dory quote.
Yeah,
just keep going. Well, thank you again. We really appreciate it.